Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're continuing to read from the Arabian Nights, today with the magic carpet, the tube, and the apple. There was once a sultan of India who had 3 sons and 1 niece, the ornaments of his court. The eldest of the princes was called Hussein, the second Ali, the youngest Ahmed, and the princess, his niece, Noor-Nihar. The Princess Noor-Nihar, having lost her father while she was still very young, had been brought up by the sultan, and now that she was grown to womanhood, the sultan thought of marrying her to some prince worthy of the alliance. She was very beautiful, and when the sultan's idea became known, the princes informed him singly that they loved her and would fain marry her. This discovery pained the sultan because he knew that there would be jealousy among his sons. He therefore sent for each separately and spoke with him, urging him to abide permanently by the lady's choice, but none of them would yield without a struggle. As he found them obstinate, he sent for them all together and said, "My children, since I have not been able to dissuade you from aspiring to marry the princess your cousin, and as I have no inclination to use my authority to give her to one in preference to his brothers, I trust I have thought of an expedient which will please you all and preserve harmony among you if you will but hear me and follow my advice. I think it would not be amiss if you were to travel separately into different countries, so that you might not meet each other. And as you know I am very curious, and delight in everything that is rare and singular, I promise my niece in marriage to him who shall bring me the most extraordinary rarity." The 3 princes, each hoping that fortune would be favorable to him, consented to this proposal. The sultan gave them money, and early the next morning they started from the city disguised as merchants. They departed by the same gate, each attended by a trusty servant, and for one day they journeyed together. Then they halted at a khan, and having agreed to meet in 1 year's time at the same place, they said farewell, and early the next morning started on their several journeys. Prince Hussein, the eldest brother, who had heard wonders of the extent, power, riches, and splendor of the kingdom of Biznagar, bent his course toward the Indian coast, and after 3 months' traveling, sometimes over deserts and barren mountains, and sometimes through populous and fertile countries, arrived at Biznagar, the capital of the kingdom of that name and the residence of its Maharaja. He lodged at a khan appointed for foreign merchants, and having learned that there were 4 principal divisions where merchants of all sorts kept their shops, in the midst of which stood the Maharaja's palace, surrounded by 3 courts, and each gate distant 2 leagues from the other, he went to one of these quarters the next day. Prince Hussein marveled at the variety and richness of the articles exposed for sale. And as he wandered from street to street, he wondered still more, for on all sides he saw the products of every country in the world. Silks, porcelain, and precious stones in abundance indicated the enormous wealth of the people. Prince Hussein had finished his inspection when a merchant, perceiving him passing with weary steps, asked him to sit down in his shop. Before long a crier came past carrying a piece of carpet for which he asked 40 purses of gold. It was only about 6 feet square, and the prince was astonished at the price. "Surely," said he, "there must be something very extraordinary about this carpet, which I cannot see, for it looks poor enough." "You have guessed right, sir," replied the crier, "and will believe it when you learn that whoever sits on this piece of carpeting may be transported in an instant whithersoever he desires to be, without being stopped by any obstacle." The prince was overjoyed, for he had found a rarity which would secure the hand of the princess. "If," said he, "the carpet has this virtue, I will gladly buy it." "Sir," replied the crier, "I have told you the truth, and it will be an easy matter to convince you. I will spread the carpeting, and when we have both sat down and you have formed the wish to be transported into your apartment at the khan, if we are not conveyed thither, it shall be no bargain." On this assurance of the crier, the prince accepted the conditions and concluded the bargain. Then, having obtained the master's leave, they went into his back shop, where they both sat down on the carpeting, and as soon as the prince had formed his wish to be transported into his apartment at the khan, he in an instant found himself and the crier there. As he wanted not a more convincing proof of the virtue of the carpeting, he counted to the crier 40 purses of gold, and gave him 20 pieces for himself. For a time Prince Hussein tarried in the city, studying the manners and customs of the people. He gained much satisfaction and information from visiting the different buildings and witnessing the various ceremonies which took place. But he desired to be nearer to the Princess Noor-Nihar, whom he most ardently loved, and he considered that he could rely upon claiming her as his bride. Therefore he paid his reckoning at the khan, spread the carpet upon the floor of his room, and he and his attendant were instantly transported to the meeting place from which he had set out. Prince Ali, the second brother, joined a caravan, and in 4 months arrived at Shiraz, which was then the capital of the Empire of Persia. And having in the way contracted a friendship with some merchants, passed for a jeweler and lodged in the same khan with them. On the morning after his arrival, Prince Ali started to inspect the valuable articles which were exposed for sale in the quarter where the jewelers lodged. He was astonished by all the wealth which he saw, and he wandered from street to street, lost in admiration. But what surprised him most was a crier who walked to and fro carrying an ivory tube in his hand, for which he asked 40 purses of gold. Prince Ali thought the man mad, but he was anxious to find out why the tube was so expensive. "Sir," said the crier, when the prince addressed him, "this tube is furnished with a glass. By looking through it, you will see whatever object you wish to behold." The crier presented the tube for his inspection, and he, wishing to see his father, looked through it and beheld the Sultan in perfect health, sitting on his throne in his council chamber. Next, he wished to see the Princess Nouronihar, and immediately he saw her sitting laughing among her companions. Prince Ali wanted no other proof. He said to the crier, "I will purchase this tube from you for the 40 purses." He then took him to the khan where he lodged, paid him the money, and received the tube. Prince Ali was overjoyed at his purchase and persuaded himself that as his brothers would not be able to meet with anything so rare and admirable, the Princess Nouronihar must become his bride. When all was ready, he joined his friends and arrived at the meeting place where he found Prince Hussein, and both waited for Prince Ahmed. Prince Ahmed took the road of Samarkand, and the day after his arrival, as he went through the city, he saw a crier who had an artificial apple in his hand for which he asked 35 purses of gold. "Let me see that apple," said the prince, "and tell me what virtue or extraordinary property it possesses to be valued at so high a rate." "Sir," replied the crier, giving it into his hand, "if you look at the mere outside of this apple, it is not very remarkable. But if you consider its properties and the great use and benefit it is to mankind, you will say it is invaluable, and that he who possesses it is a master of a great treasure. It cures all sick persons of the most mortal diseases, and this merely by the patient smelling it." "If one may believe you," replied Prince Ahmed, "the virtues of this apple are wonderful, and it is indeed valuable. But what proof have you of what you say?" "Sir," replied the crier, "the truth is known to the whole city of Samarkand." While the crier was detailing to Prince Ahmed the virtues of the artificial apple, many persons came about them and confirmed what he declared, and one amongst the rest said he had a friend dangerously ill whose life was despaired of, which was a favorable opportunity to show the experiment, upon which Prince Ahmed told the crier he would give him 40 purses for the apple, if it cured the sick person by smelling it. The crier said to Prince Ahmed, "Come, sir, let us go and make the experiment, and the apple shall be yours." The experiment succeeded, and the prince, after he had counted out to the crier 40 purses and had received the apple from him, waited with the greatest impatience for the departure of a caravan for the Indies. When Prince Ahmed joined his brothers, they embraced with tenderness and expressed much joy at meeting again. Then Prince Hussein said, "Brothers, let us postpone the narrative of our travels, and let us at once show each other what we have bought, as a curiosity that we may do ourselves justice beforehand, and judge to which of us our father may give the preference. To set the example, I will tell you that the rarity which I have brought from the kingdom of Biznagar is the carpeting on which I sit, which looks but ordinary, and makes no show, but it possesses wonderful virtues. Whoever sits on it and desires to be transported to any place is immediately carried thither. I made the experiment myself before I paid the 40 purses which I most readily gave for it. I expect now that you should tell me whether what you have brought is to be compared with this carpet." Prince Ali spoke next and said, "I must own that your carpet is very wonderful, yet I am as well satisfied with my purchase as you can possibly be with yours. Here is an ivory tube which also cost me 40 purses. It looks ordinary enough, yet on looking through it you can behold whatever you desire to see, no matter how far distant it may be. Take it, brother, and try for yourself." Hussein took the ivory tube from Prince Ali with an intention to see the Princess Nouronihar, when Ali and Prince Ahmed, who kept their eyes fixed upon him, were extremely surprised to see his countenance change in such a manner as expressed extraordinary alarm and affliction. And he cried out, "Alas, princes, to what purpose have we undertaken such long and fatiguing journeys, with but the hope of being recompensed by the possession of the charming Nouronihar, when in a few moments that lovely princess will breathe her last? I saw her in her bed, surrounded by her women, all in tears, who seemed to expect her death. Take the tube, behold yourselves the miserable state she is in, and mingle your tears with mine." Prince Ali took the tube out of Hussein's hand, and after he had seen the same object, with sensible grief, presented it to Ahmed, who took it, to behold the melancholy sight, which so much concerned them all. When Prince Ahmed had taken the tube out of Ali's hands and saw that the Princess Nuranahar's end was so near, he addressed himself to his two brothers and said, "Brothers, the Princess Nuranahar is indeed at death's door, but provided we lose no time, we may preserve her life." He then took the artificial apple out of his bosom and resumed, "This apple cost me as much as the carpet or tube and has healing properties. If a sick person smells it, though in the last agonies, it will restore him to perfect health immediately. I have made the experiment and can show you its wonderful effect on the person of the Princess Nuranahar if we hasten to assist her." "We cannot make more dispatch," said Prince Hussein, "than by transporting ourselves instantly into her chamber by means of my carpet. Come, lose no time, sit down. It is large enough to hold us all." Ali and Ahmed sat down by Hussein, and as their interest was the same, they all framed the same wish and were transported instantaneously into the Princess Nuranahar's chamber. The presence of the three princes, who were so little expected, alarmed the princess's women, who could not comprehend by what enchantment three men should be among them, for they did not know them at first. Prince Ahmed no sooner saw himself in Nuranahar's chamber and perceived the princess dying, than he rose off the carpet and went to the bedside and put the apple to her nostrils. The princess instantly opened her eyes and asked to be dressed with the same freedom and recollection as if she had wakened out of a sound sleep. Her women presently informed her that she was obliged to the three princes, her cousins, and particularly to Prince Ahmed, for the sudden recovery of her health. She immediately expressed her joy at seeing them and thanked them all together, but afterwards Prince Ahmed in particular. While the princess was dressing, the princes went to throw themselves at their father's feet, but when they came to him, they found he had been previously informed of their unexpected arrival, and by what means the princess had been so suddenly cured. The Sultan received and embraced them with the greatest joy, both for their return and the wonderful recovery of the princess his niece, who had been given over by the physicians. After the usual compliments, each of the princes brought the rarity which he had brought, or presented the rarity which he had brought. Prince Hussein his carpet, Prince Ali his ivory tube, and Prince Ahmed the artificial apple. And after each had commended his present, as he put it into the Sultan's hands, they begged of him to pronounce their fate and declare to which of them he would give the Princess Nuranahar, according to his promise. The Sultan of the Indies, having heard all that the princess had to say, remained some time silent, considering what answer he should make. At last he said to them in terms full of wisdom, "I would declare for one of you, my children, if I could do it with justice. But consider whether I can. As for you, Hussein, the princess would be very ungrateful if she did not show her sense of the value of your carpet, which was so necessary a means toward effecting her cure. But consider, it would have been of little use if you had not been acquainted with her illness by Ali's tube, or if Ahmed had not applied his artificial apple. Therefore, as neither the carpet, the ivory tube, nor the artificial apple has the least preference to the other articles, I cannot grant the princess to any one of you, and the only fruit you have reaped from your travels is the glory of having equally contributed to restore her to health. As this is the case, you see that I must have recourse to other means to determine the choice I ought to make, and as there is time enough between this and night, I will do it today. Go and procure each of you a bow and arrow, repair to the plain where the horses are exercised. I will soon join you, and will give the Princess Nuranahar to him who shoots the farthest." The three princes had no objection to the decision of the Sultan. When they were dismissed, each provided himself with a bow and arrow, and they went to the plain appointed, followed by a great concourse of people. The Sultan did not make them wait long for him. As soon as he arrived, Prince Hussein, as the eldest, took his bow and arrow and shot first. Prince Ali shot next and much beyond him, and Prince Ahmed last of all. But it so happened that nobody could see where his arrow fell, and notwithstanding all the search made by himself and all the spectators, it was not to be found. Though it was believed that he had shot the farthest, still, as his arrow could not be found, the Sultan determined in favor of Prince Ali, and gave orders for preparations to be made for the solemnization of the nuptials, which were celebrated a few days after with great magnificence. Prince Hussein would not honor the feast with his presence. He could not bear to see the Princess Nuranahar wed Prince Ali, who he said did not deserve her better nor love her more than himself. In short, his grief was so extreme that he left the court and renounced all right of succession to the crown, to turn dervish and put himself under the discipline of a famous sheik who had gained great reputation for his exemplary life. Prince Ahmed, urged by the same motive, did not attend the wedding, yet he did not renounce the world as Hussein had done. But as he could not imagine what could have become of his arrow, he resolved to search for it, that he might not have anything to reproach himself with. With this intent, he went to the place where Hussein's and Ali's arrows were gathered up, and proceeding straight forwards from thence, looked carefully on both sides as he advanced. He went so far that at last he began to think his labor was in vain. Yet he could not help proceeding till he came to some steep, craggy rocks, which completely barred the way. To his great astonishment, he perceived an arrow which he recognized as his own at the foot of the rocks. "Certainly," said he to himself, "neither I nor any man living could shoot an arrow so far. Perhaps fortune, to make amends for depriving me of what I thought the greatest happiness of my life, may have reserved a greater blessing for my comfort." There were many cavities, into one of which the prince entered, and looked about, beheld an iron door, which he feared was fastened, but pushing against it, it opened and disclosed an easy descent, which he walked down with his arrow in his hand. At first he thought he was going into a dark place, but presently a light quite different from that which he had quitted succeeded, and entering into a spacious square, he beheld a magnificent palace. At the same instant, a lady of majestic air and of remarkable beauty advanced, attended by a troop of ladies, all magnificently dressed. As soon as Ahmed perceived the lady, he hastened to pay his respects, and the lady, seeing him, said, "Come near, Prince Ahmed, you are welcome." Prince Ahmed was surprised at hearing himself addressed by name, but he bowed low and followed into the great hall. Here she seated herself upon a sofa and requested the prince to sit beside her. Then she said, "You are surprised that I know you, yet you cannot be ignorant, as the Koran informs you that the world is inhabited by genies as well as men. I am the daughter of one of the most powerful and distinguished of these genies, and my name is Peri Banu. I am no stranger to your loves or your travels, since it was I myself who exposed to sale the artificial apple which you bought at Samarkand, the carpet which Prince Hussein purchased at Bisnagar, and the tube which Prince Ali brought from Shiraz. You seem to me worthy of a more happy fate than that of possessing the Princess Nuranahar, and that you might attain to it, I carried your arrow to the place where you found it. It is in your power to avail yourself of the favorable opportunity which presents itself to make you happy." Ahmed made no answer, but knelt to kiss the hem of her garment, but she would not allow him, and presented her hand, which he kissed 1,000 times, and kept fast locked in his. "Well, Prince Ahmed," said she, "will you pledge your faith to me as I do mine to you?" "Yes, madam," replied the prince in an ecstasy of joy. "What can I do more fortunate for myself or with greater pleasure?" "Then," answered the fairy, "you are my husband, and I am your wife. Our fairy marriages are contracted with no other ceremonies, and yet are more indissoluble than those among men, with all their formalities." The fairy Peri Banu then conducted Prince Ahmed round the palace, where he saw much that delighted him, and showed the wealth of the palace. At last she led him to a rich apartment in which the marriage feast was spread. The fairy had ordered a sumptuous repast to be prepared, and the prince marveled at the variety and delicacy of the dishes, many of which were quite strange to him. While they ate, there was music, and after dessert, a large number of fairies and genies appeared and danced before them. Day after day, new amusements were provided, each more entrancing than the last, and every day he grew more and more in love with the beautiful Peri Banu. At the end of 6 months, he bethought him of his father and asked permission to visit him, but the genie persuaded him not to go. "Only harm would come of it, my love," she told him. Meantime, his father, the Sultan of the Indies, grieved over the loss of his 2 sons. He had learned of Hussein and of his place of retreat, but there was no trace of Ahmed. He called to his aid a sorceress, but she was unable to find the missing prince. As the days went by, Prince Ahmed did not renew his request for permission to visit his father, but the fairy Peri Banu saw that the desire was in his mind, and at last said to him, "Prince, I can see you are grieving for a sight of your father, and I am willing to let you go, but you must promise that your absence shall not be long. Do not speak of your marriage or of the place of our residence. Let your parent be satisfied with the knowledge that you are happy." Prince Ahmed was greatly pleased at this, and accompanied by 20 horsemen, he set out on a charger which was most richly caparisoned, and as beautiful a creature as any in the Sultan of the Indies stables. It was no great distance to his father's capital, and when Prince Ahmed arrived, the people received him with acclamations and followed him in crowds to the palace. The Sultan embraced him with great joy, complaining at the same time with a fatherly tenderness of the affliction his long absence had occasioned. "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "when my arrow so mysteriously disappeared, I wanted to find it, and returning alone, I commenced my search. I sought all about the place where Hussein's and Ali's arrows were found, and where I imagined mine must have fallen, but all my labor was in vain. I proceeded along the plain in a straight line for a league and found nothing. I was about to give up my search when I found myself drawn forward against my will, and after having gone 4 leagues to that part of the plain where it is bounded by rocks, I saw an arrow. I ran to the spot, took it up, and knew it to be the same which I had shot. Then I knew that your decision was faulty and that some power was working for my good. But as to this mystery, I beg you will not be offended if I remain silent, and that you will be satisfied to know that I am happy and content with my fate. Nevertheless, I was grieved lest you should suffer in uncertainty, but I beg you to allow me to come here occasionally to visit you. Son, I wish to penetrate no farther into your secrets. Your presence has restored to me the joy I have not felt for a long time, and you shall always be welcome when you can come. Prince Ahmed stayed 3 days at his father's court, and on the 4th returned to the fairy Peri Banu, who received him with great joy. Once every month, Ahmed visited his father and was received by the Sultan with the same joy and satisfaction. For several months he constantly paid him visits, and always with a richer and more brilliant equipage. At last the Sultan's favorites, who judged of Prince Ahmed's power by the splendor of his appearance, contrived to make him jealous of his son. He sent for the sorceress and bade her watch where his son went. The sorceress was more successful this time, following Ahmed to the beautiful palace, and by feigning sickness had herself carried within. The fairy Peri Banu, taking pity on the woman, directed 2 of her ladies-in-waiting to conduct the sorceress to a splendid apartment. She was laid on a luxurious bed, and one of the attendants brought her a cup full of a certain liquor. "Drink this," she said. "It is the water of the Fountain of Lions, and a potent remedy against fevers. You will find the effect of it in less than an hour's time." The attendants then left her and returned at the end of an hour. When she saw them open the door of the apartment, she cried out, "Oh, the admirable potion! It has wrought its cure, and I have waited with impatience to desire you to conduct me to your charitable mistress, as I would not lose time but prosecute my journey." The 2 women conducted her through several apartments, all more superb than that wherein she had lain, into a large hall, the most richly and magnificently furnished in all the palace. Peri Banu was seated in this hall upon a throne of massive gold, enriched with diamonds, rubies, and pearls of an extraordinary size, and attended on each hand by a great number of beautiful fairies, all richly dressed. At the sight of so much splendor, the sorceress was not only dazzled, but so struck that after she had prostrated herself before the throne, she could not open her lips to thank the fairy as she had proposed. However, Peri Banu saved her the trouble and said, "Good woman, I am glad that you are able to pursue your journey. I will not detain you, but perhaps you may like to see my palace. Follow my women, and they will show it to you." The old sorceress, who had not power or courage to say a word, prostrated herself once more, with her head on the carpet that covered the foot of the throne, took her leave, and was conducted by the 2 fairies through the palace. Afterwards, they conducted her to the iron gate through which she had entered, and let her depart, wishing her a good journey. On her return, the sorceress related to the Sultan how she had succeeded in entering the fairy's palace, and told him all the wonders she had seen there. When she had finished her narrative, the sorceress said, "I shudder when I consider the misfortunes which may happen to you, for who can say that the fairy may not inspire him with the unnatural design of dethroning your majesty and seizing the crown of the Indies? This is what your majesty ought to consider as of the utmost importance." The Sultan of the Indies had been consulting with his favorites when he was told of the sorceress's arrival. He now ordered her to follow him to them. He acquainted them with what he had learned might happen. Then one of the favorites said, "In order to prevent this, now that the prince is in your power, you ought to put him under arrest. I would not take away his life, but make him a close prisoner." This advice all the other favorites unanimously applauded. But the sorceress said, "No. The fairy would work some spells on us if we imprisoned her husband. A better way is to make demands on his filial love, and if he refuses, then we will have just cause for complaint. For example, ask him to procure you a tent which can be carried in a man's hand, but so large as to shelter your whole army." The Sultan agreed and made this request to his son on his next visit. Prince Ahmed was greatly embarrassed, but said he would present the request to Peri Banu. He returned to the palace shamefaced, but to his surprise the fairy only laughed. "It is but a trifle," she told him. "I will gladly give your father what he desires." She then sent for her treasurer, to whom she said, "Nur Jahan, bring me the largest pavilion in my treasury." Nur Jahan returned presently with a pavilion which could not only be held but concealed in the palm of the hand, and presented it to her mistress, who gave it to Prince Ahmed to look at. When Prince Ahmed saw the pavilion, which the fairy called the largest in her treasury, he fancied she had a mind to banter him, and his surprise soon appeared in his countenance, which Peri Banu perceived and laughed. "What, Prince," cried she, "do you think I jest with you? You will see that I am in earnest." "Nur Jahan," she said to her treasurer, "go and set it up that he may judge whether the Sultan will think it large enough." The treasurer went out immediately with it from the palace and set it up. The prince found it large enough to shelter 2 armies as numerous as that of his father. "You see," said the fairy, "that the pavilion is larger than your father may have occasion for, but you are to observe that it has one property, that it becomes larger or smaller according to the extent of the army it has to cover, without applying any hands to it." The treasurer took down the tent again, reduced it to its first size, brought it, and put it into the prince's hand. He took it, and without staying longer than till the next day, mounted his horse and rode off to the Sultan his father. The Sultan was in great surprise at the prince's speedy return. He took the tent, but after he had admired its smallness, his amazement was so great that he could not recover himself when he had it set up in the great plain before mentioned, and found it large enough to shelter an army twice as large as he could bring into the field. The Sultan expressed great obligation to the prince for so noble a present, desiring him to return his thanks to the fairy, and to show what a value he set upon it, ordered it to be carefully laid up in his treasury. But within himself he felt greater jealousy than ever of his son. Therefore, more intent upon his ruin, he went to consult the sorceress again, who advised him to engage the prince to bring him some of the water of the Fountain of Lions. In the evening, when the Sultan was surrounded as usual by all his court, and the prince came to pay his respects among the rest, he put forward his request for a bottle of the curative water. Again Ahmed returned to the fairy Peri Banu, and unwillingly tendered his father's second request. "I do not ask this of myself," he said stammeringly. "I do but repeat the words of my father, the Sultan, and I am grieved that he was not content with what you did for him before. I leave it to your own pleasure, whether you will gratify or reject this new desire. It shall be as you please." "No, no," replied the fairy, "I will satisfy him, and whatever advice the sorceress may give him, for I see that he hearkens to her counsel, he shall find no fault with you or me. There is much wickedness in this demand, as you will understand by what I am going to tell you. The Fountain of Lions is situated in the middle of a court of a great castle, the entrance into which is guarded by 4 fierce lions, 2 of which sleep alternately, while the other 2 are awake. But let not that frighten you. I will supply you with means to pass by them without danger." The fairy Peri Banu was at work with her needle, and as she had several clues of thread, she took up one and presenting it to Prince Ahmed said, "First, take this clue of thread. I will tell you presently the use of it. In the second place, you must have 2 horses. One you must ride yourself, and the other you must lead, which must be loaded with a sheep cut into 4 quarters that must be killed today. In the third place, you must be provided with a bottle which I will give you to bring the water in. Set out early tomorrow morning, and when you have passed the iron gate, throw before you the clue of thread, which will roll till it reaches the gates of the castle. Follow it, and when it stops, as the gates will be open, you will see the 4 lions. The 2 that are awake will, by their roaring, wake the other 2. Be not alarmed, but throw each of them a quarter of the sheep, and then clasp spurs to your horse and ride to the fountain. Fill your bottle without alighting, and return with the same expedition. The lions will be so busy eating, they will let you pass unmolested." Prince Ahmed set out the next morning at the time appointed him by the fairy, and followed her directions punctually. When he arrived at the gates of the castle, he distributed the quarters of the sheep among the 4 lions, and passing through the midst of them, reached the fountain, filled his bottle, and returned safely. When he had got a little distance from the castle gates, he turned about, and perceiving 2 of the lions coming after him, drew his saber and prepared himself for defense. But as he went forward, he saw one of them turn out of the road at some distance, and showed by his head and tail that he did not come to do him any harm, but only to go before him, and that the other stayed behind to follow. He therefore put his sword again into its scabbard. Guarded in this manner, he arrived at the capital of the Indies, but the lions never left him till they had conducted him to the gates of the Sultan's palace, after which they returned the way they had come, though not without alarming the populace, who fled or hid themselves to avoid them. Notwithstanding, they walked gently and showed no signs of fierceness. A number of officers came to attend the prince while he dismounted and conduct him to the Sultan's apartment, who was at that time conversing with his favorites. He approached the throne, laid the bottle at the Sultan's feet, kissed the carpet which covered the footstool, and rising, said, "I have brought you, sir, the salutary water which your majesty so much desired, but at the same time wish you such health as never to have occasion to make use of it." After the prince had concluded, the sultan placed him on his right hand and said, "Son, I am much obliged to you for this valuable present, but I have one thing more to ask of you, after which I shall expect nothing more from your obedience, nor from your interest with your wife. This request is, to bring me a man not above 1.5 feet high, whose beard is 30 feet long, who carries upon his shoulders a bar of iron of 500 weight, which he uses as a quarterstaff, and who can speak." The next day the prince returned to Peri Banu, to whom he related his father's new demand, which, he said, he looked upon to be a thing more impossible than the two first. "For," added he, "I cannot imagine there is or can be such a man in the world." "Do not alarm yourself, prince," replied the fairy. "You ran a risk in fetching the water of the Fountain of Lions for your father, but there is no danger in finding this man. It is my brother Shabar, who is far from being like me, though we both have the same father. He is of so violent a nature that nothing can prevent his giving bloody marks of his resentment for a slight offense, yet on the other hand is so liberal as to oblige anyone in whatever they desire. I will send for him, but prepare yourself not to be alarmed at his extraordinary figure." "What, my queen," replied Prince Ahmed, "do you say Shabar is your brother? Let him be ever so ugly or deformed, I shall love and honor him as my nearest relation." The fairy ordered a gold chafing dish to be set with a fire in it under the porch of her palace. She took some incense and threw it into the fire, when there arose a thick cloud of smoke. Some moments after, the fairy said to Prince Ahmed, "Prince, there comes my brother. Do you see him?" The prince immediately perceived Shabar, who looked at the prince with fierce eyes and asked Peri Banu who that man was, to which she replied, "He is my husband, brother. His name is Ahmed. He is the son of the Sultan of the Indies. On his account I have taken the liberty now to call for you." At these words, Shabar, looking at Prince Ahmed with a favorable eye, which however diminished neither his fierceness nor savage look, said, "It is enough for me that he is your husband. I will do for him whatever he desires." "The Sultan, his father," replied Peri Banu, "is curious to see you, and I desire he may be your guide to the Sultan's court." "He needs but lead the way. I will follow him," replied Shabar. The next morning Shabar set out with Prince Ahmed to visit the Sultan. When they arrived at the gates of the capital, the people, as soon as they saw Shabar, ran and hid themselves in their shops and houses, shutting their doors, while others, taking to their heels, communicated their fear to all they met, who stayed not to look behind them. Insomuch the Shabar and Prince Ahmed, as they went along, found all the streets and squares desolate, till they came to the palace, where the porters, instead of preventing Shabar from entering, ran away too, so that the prince and he advanced without any obstacle to the council hall, where the Sultan was seated on his throne giving audience. Shabar went fiercely up to the throne without waiting to be presented, and accosted the Sultan in these words, "You have asked for me? Speak." The Sultan turned away his head to avoid the sight of so terrible an object. Shabar was so much provoked at this rude reception that he instantly lifted up his iron bar and let it fall on his head, killing him, before Prince Ahmed could intercede in his behalf. Shabar then smote all the favorites who had given the Sultan bad advice. He spared the Grand Vizier, who was a just man. When this terrible execution was over, Shabar came out of the council hall into the courtyard with the iron bar upon his shoulder, and looking at the Grand Vizier, said, "I know there is here a certain sorceress, who is a greater enemy of the prince my brother-in-law than all those base favorites I have chastised. Let her be brought to me immediately." The Grand Vizier instantly sent for her, and as soon as she was brought, Shabar slew her with his iron bar. After this, he said, "I will treat the whole city in the same manner, if they do not immediately acknowledge Prince Ahmed, my brother-in-law, as Sultan of the Indies." Then all who were present made the air ring with the repeated acclamations of "Long life to Sultan Ahmed!" Shabar caused him to be clothed in the royal vestments, installed him on the throne, and after he had made all swear homage and fidelity, returned to his sister Peri Banu, whom he brought with great pomp and made her Sultana of the Indies. Prince Ali and Princess Nuranihar were given a considerable province, with its capital, where they spent the rest of their lives. Afterwards he sent an officer to Hussein to acquaint him with the change, and make him an offer of any province he might choose. But that prince thought himself so happy in his solitude that he desired the officer to return his brother thanks for the kindness he proposed, assuring him of his submission, but that the only favor he desired was to be indulged with leave to retire to the palace he had chosen for his retreat. We stop there and start tomorrow with the story of Aladdin. Thank you. Bye-bye.